Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rich Johnson, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Stay on Track and Get Some Sleep, Marketing Application Best Practices. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's webcast. To receive credit for attending this webcast, attendees will need to enter a completion code in the RAPS Learning Portal. We will show the code on screen before the Q&A segment, as well as in the public chat in the GoTo interface. The code will also be distributed after the program ends in the follow-up email that will come from GoTo. To claim credit, log into the Learning Portal, and on the top right corner of your screen, there is a box to enter your completion code. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee control panel. You should see something that looks similar to this on your own computer in the upper right corner. You're listening and using your device's audio by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions for today's presenters by entering them into the questions pane at the bottom of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Jessica Walsh, Senior Marketing Operations Manager for Synchrogenics. Jessica?
Thank you, Rich. Okay. Welcome, and thank you for joining RAPS and Synchrogenics, the Certara company, for today's presentation on marketing application best practices. Over the next 45 minutes, Synchrogenics' regulatory experts, Demetrius Carter, Steve Sidley, and Elaine Taylor, will offer tips and guidance for acceleration, submission leadership, and regulatory strategy that you can apply to your marketing application to help ensure a successful submission. First up is Demetrius Carter, Senior Vice President of Services Operations. Demetrius is a clinical development executive with more than 20 years of drug development experience, including both the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. Demetrius is responsible for Synchrogenics' regulatory writing, strategy, and operations teams. Demetrius, I'll turn it over to you.
Jessica, thank you for that warm welcome. And on behalf of the Synchrogenics team, I want to say thanks to everyone for your time and attendance today. And so, as we start this conversation really about the drug approval process, you're here for some of our subject matter expertise, really about best practices as it relates to driving your submission and building your dossier, as well as your interaction with the regulatory agencies. But what I'd like to do is really start maybe with what is a burning platform. Why is there a need for acceleration in the drug approval process? And I think there are lots of reasons that we can identify, but I think there's kind of four pillars that we're thinking about that's really driving the need to accelerate. And I'll talk a little bit about the context for each of them. First being from a patient centricity perspective, right? Delivering for patients. There are clearly patients out there that are really looking forward to innovation in this space, new therapies and treatment options that are being available to them. Another area is really around just kind of driving innovation. So you're seeing the need for increased innovation in the drug development, medical device space, and it's coming and being asked for by patients, by providers, caregivers, by Ministry of Health, government agencies. So we need and demand more innovation in the healthcare space. I think thirdly, also about managing stakeholders' expectations. I mean, look, the stark reality is that from a pharmaceutical development perspective, these are generally for-profit organizations, right? So, and they're being funded by stakeholders who are looking for a return on their investment. And so, how do we manage that expectation going forward? And then I think lastly, there's a real desire to improve the public health of individuals around the world. And we'll talk a little bit about the role that this process plays in that. environment. So let's talk about just first delivering for patients, right? They're clearly when the activities that we're doing, and for each of you who are touching clinical development, regulatory affairs, the healthcare landscape, you clearly hear the stories about patients who are waiting for new therapies, right? We continue to raise the bar on therapeutic delivery and improvements in standard of care. We're looking at ways that we can impact people's lives, whether it's increasing their longevity, the quality of life index for individuals, so improving health quality outcomes, and we see that being impacted and the ability of people to live longer. We want to make sure that we're accelerating that treatment access, right? So those individuals who have participated in clinical trials, how do we accelerate them as well as others having access to these new therapies? And then I think, there's probably a niche area that's occurring around unmet medical needs, right? So we're seeing in the development, particularly of personalized medicine, targeted medicines that really are treating, for instance, a rare and orphan disease space, or either very hard to treat diseases like certain oncology spaces as well. And so, when we are delayed in the drug development process, I mean, there's a real impact, right? So again, thinking about the patient who's on the other end that's waiting to benefit from that drug approval. And so there's some really poignant data that was recently published in ASCO, really about what happens when there's a delay in the regulatory development process. And this is related to oncology products. But they've quoted here that approximately every hour of U.S. regulatory delays leads to approximately 29 life years, right? So now we're talking about mortality of patients are really negatively impacted when we're delayed through the process. And if you look at that on a totality worldwide, that number jumps to over 260 life years are impacted, right? So we're talking about now people's lives being at stake when we're delayed in actually getting these drugs approvals, moving forward. And then if you continue to look at it, at what's happened over time, as we look at trying to accelerate the drug development process, you can see, particularly in the oncology space, the impact that accelerating and bringing these new these new drugs to market has had on patients. And so the data here that's coming out of Cancer Journal for Clinicians really talks about cancer survival rates, and you've seen the improvement over time since the 1970s. And really the reason why you've seen the positive impact on mortality rates and the decline in mortality, the decline in death rates is because of better screening processes, but we've also improved standard of care, as well as we've developed targeted therapies that really have a positive impact on patients who are waiting. So there is truly a burning platform around patients being able to continue to have access here. So, but the need for that innovation is also really important because it's going to allow, different treatment options available for patients as well, right? So we're serving unmet medical needs, right? So you're seeing, again, for instance, going back to the thoughts around rare and orphan diseases, ability to, give options to patients who previously, didn't have treatment options available to them. The ability to use emerging technologies, medical devices, in vitro diagnostics to allow us to be able to identify and create treatment regimens for patient disease states that we haven't had before. The creation of new classes of drugs and identifying new indications, right? So the ability to use technology, and so for instance in the immuno-oncology space, right, targeted drug pathways that are very specific to the cancer type that individual has been succumbed with. So it's really a significant area or space where the clinicians are really asking for us to step up and drive innovation in this space. And you see that the ministries of health, and in this example that we're sharing here, that the FDA has really been supporting it, EMEA as well, particularly as it relates to improving new molecular entities, but also really about how they're supporting more of this personalized medicine space, and particularly as it relates to orphan designations. And you can see really within the last 3 years or so, the jump in the number of orphan products that have been approved by the FDA has been significant And that's in comparison to what you saw in the early 2000s. You can see almost a 2.5x increase in the number of orphan drugs that have been designated. So again, we're talking about patient populations that really have limited options available to them, but because of regulatory changes, in the Prescription Drug User Act, the way that Ministry of Health are evaluating drugs in this space through an accelerated process is really leading to innovations, but more importantly, treatment options for these patient populations. So the third area is really around managing stakeholder expectations. I mean, this is the part we don't really want to talk about, right? The demand or the need for us to be able to fund innovation, right? So the commercialization of these medicinal products really allow for the return of that funding back into the research and development process, right? It's a necessary component of the process, right? You know, these companies are out here, they've got milestones, they've made commitments to their stakeholders around when they're going to develop products and when they're expecting to actually receive revenue based on those product development activities, right? It's not only important for launching those particular products, but it's also funding ongoing and future research, right? If you look at some of the data, you know, there's lots of information out in the literature, but if you look at some of the work that Damasi has done and the team at the Tufts Center for Drug Development, you know, you're looking at cycles of drug development anywhere between 8 to 15 years to bring a drug to market. And that's significant, right? There's a significant amount of investment and time in order to be able to bring new drugs. And so, you know, how are you funding that? And it really is predicated on previous successful commercial launches in order to be able to fund that ongoing and future research. You may also need to do other things as far as post-marketing commitments, you know, looking at line extensions, new indications, and how we develop into other markets is really important. And so you can see, again, referring back to some of the work that the Tufts Center has done, you can see the growth really in the cost of drug development. And so the massive amount of capital that's required in order to bring a drug to market. And so, you know, some of this information is still just from the early 2010s, but you can see that those costs have accelerated, you know, upwards of $2.5 billion. And so, I mean, there's recent, you know, suggestions in the literature that those numbers now are reaching, you know, closer to $5 billion to bring a drug to market and commercialize it, you know, as an organization. Then you also think about, again, the risk that's involved, because there is certain a component here that says that after all of this work is done and you actually submit your dossier, there still is a risk that the Ministry of Health may not actually accept your application. You may get a complete response letter, or even worse, it could be a refusal to file letter associated with your submission. But the good news is that if you are successful getting it through one of the major agencies like the FDA, there's good concordance in the approval cycle from an EU perspective. And so this data here shows that roughly about 85% of the time, the FDA and the EMEA agree with each other on drug approval, right? So if you submit to the FDA and in parallel you're submitting to the EMEA, there's good concordance that, roughly that they'll share. So only about 15% of the time do you see some disagreement or discordance between those two ministries of health. So good. So the good story here is that if you've got a strong, story to tell, key messaging that makes sense for one of the actual key agencies, then it likely bodes well for your success rate within the other markets. So last time we'll talk about just public health, right? So I think, it's really important that drug approvals really accelerate the conversation about what are we trying to do ultimately, which is have a positive impact on global public health, right? We want to improve standard of care for all populations across the world. We want to increase healthcare access. I mean, there's very clear and supportive data that, part of the biggest lever that we can pull around improving global health is really around access to quality healthcare, which includes access to treatment options and to people within those communities. Our ability to support the real world evidence pool, and so how we're actually informing providers and their ability to really be able to address health disparities and inequities across the actual particular space. And this is not even, there's nothing more poignant than, today's conversations that we're having as it relates to COVID-19, right? So, there is truly, I think everyone understands the need for us to have treatment options, including vaccines that are available to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is important because, again, if you think about the disproportionate way in which COVID-19 is having an impact on different populations, again, it really highlights the need that, this burning platform for acceleration is really important. And so, this is really timely given that, we've now reached over 206,000 people in the United States that actually have died as it relates to COVID-19. You're now talking about, 2 million people globally that have been negatively impacted. So these are tremendous opportunities for us to really be able to have a positive impact on public health. And you can see that here just even in the United States, that if you look at the mortality rate, right, the death toll for COVID-19, you've got a factor of 3.4 times increased rate for people who are Black or African American in the United States as compared to their white counterparts, right? And so you see there's very clear evidence of a health disparity that's in play as well. You look at it just about hospitalization. I mean, you're seeing a similar pattern, right? So you're looking at 5.3 times as many African Americans are being hospitalized as it relates to COVID-19. And you also start looking at, that's for people of Native Americans that are about 5.3. I mean, we're talking about 4.7 for African Americans. So you can see that people of color are disparately being impacted. And so the need, the demand, the requirement for this public health issue to develop therapies and options for treatment is going to be really important for us moving forward. So again, there's lots of reasons for us to be restless, and we think about the real platform that we have for accelerating drug approval. Patients are clearly waiting, so we think about the work that we're doing, that there's a patient at the other end of that drug approval. Innovation is really driving improvement, so looking for ways in which we can actually use technology, research, science to really improve the quality of outcomes for patients globally. How are we supporting this research? I mean, the data very clearly shows that the costs for, both preclinical and clinical, as well as post-marketing demands for research costs are increasing. And so we've got to have this opportunity to commercialize these products that can actually fund that research and that innovation in the future. And I think we all have a moral obligation and expectation that we're going to be contributing to the improvement of public health outcomes globally by accelerating drug approval process. So, I think at the end of the day, these are things that I know that many of you are struggling with and finding ways to try to manage and navigate the stress associated with that. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of the best practices in submission leadership next. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Steve Sibley. So Steve Sibley, he heads up our global submissions and submissions leadership team here at Synchrogenics. He's got a wealth of experience with more than 30 years in the pharmaceutical industry. And he's got some real good success stories about how he's helped to guide clients through the stress of the regulatory submission process. So over to you, Steve.
Excellent. Thank you, Demetrius. And thank you all for joining today's session. So I'd like to build on now what Demetrius has kind of laid out as a foundation about how critical submission success is, and timely submission success is, both for the industry, your company, yourself, and most importantly, patients. So I want to walk through what are some of the ways that you can improve your chances of success, improve the efficiency of your submission activities so that you can sleep a little better at night. Right, waiting to advance to the next slide.
Jessica, can you give keyboard mouse control to Steve?
Sorry for the delay. Well, while we wait for that next slide to come up, I will be breaking
You
this
should
down
be
into.
able to click on the slide for
Can
it to
I?
advance. No.
To advance here. Yeah, it's still not advancing.
Jessica, are you on the line? Oh,
There. There we go. Make sure I can move it. Yes. All right. Thank you. Sorry for that technical glitch. So what I'd like to cover during my time here is delivering and developing your submission plan. So you want to build a plan that is reasonable, that you can work with, so that you can stick to it and deliver on time and quality. And the key to this that we'll focus on is that there's a lot of communication required, as I'm sure anyone who's been through this process is aware. So I've broken this into 3 parts around assessing what needs to be done, what information you have to assemble, how to create a strong submission where you focus on the strengths and also confront the weaknesses, how to go about building your plan. What situation are you in? Are you building out from a rate limiting step, or are you building backwards from a committed submission date? And then around how to actually deliver on that plan and the communication required to get there, because you're going to have to be able to hold your team accountable throughout this process. So with that, move on to assessing, building the foundation for your submission. And I really view this as the most critical stage. The very end, when you're trying to make everything come together, always feels like the most critical, but it is won and lost here in this assessment phase. And this applies across all disciplines. Doesn't matter if it's regulatory, CMC, non-clinical, or clinical. This is the point where you want to make sure you've really thought things through, gotten things right, and kind of set the direction for your activities. I want to start with regulatory history. This sometimes gets overlooked. It's really important, and something that I've made a point of trying to do when working with new clients for the first time is to work with them to pull out all of the agency meeting minutes from all of the health authority meetings that they've had, go through those, assemble that into a table of what were the questions you asked, what was the feedback you got, did you reach an agreement, and what did you put in place as a result of that agreement. And I don't think I've yet had a situation where there wasn't something that, by going back through those at the start of a submission development, there wasn't some item that the team had forgotten about or was with a prior company, if you've in-licensed the product, where there was an agreement and but it has not been fully implemented or wasn't followed, or there is a very good reason why it changed over time, but it's something that will have to be addressed in the submission because it doesn't match what was agreed previously. So I highly recommend pulling out your all your meeting minutes and creating some kind of table where you've accounted for every one of those interactions, every one of those answers and agreements. One thing you'll find when you do that is that it's a very good way to also identify what the strengths of your program are and what the weaknesses are. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you want to highlight and build out those strengths, but also confront the weaknesses. The last thing you want is to try to ignore it or hide it, because then when the health authority goes through your documents, through your submission, when they pick up on that, which they will, they're going to have to form their own view on it when you have an opportunity to put that into context. And there are often, what I find is people try to ignore those, but when you actually confront them, there is more often than not very good explanations to provide around why that weakness is not actually an issue or a problem. I would also say don't shy away from strengths. I worked on a program years ago where it was an MRI contrast agent. It was compared against the current standard without contrast, and also against CT, which was considered the gold standard. It not only was significantly better on all of the primary and secondary endpoints against current standard of care without contrast, but it also was significantly better than the gold standard. And it actually was a huge struggle for the team to accept that they could make really strong positive statements about how they compared against the gold standard in addition to the standard of care. So it's not very often that you're going to find yourself in that type of situation, but if you do, don't shy away from that. It's a really strong thing that you can say. Unmet medical needs. So this is another area that it's really helpful to get very clear on up front. So your product may be, the unmet need it's addressing is that the current therapies are dosed twice a day and yours allows to dose once a day or once a week. Or maybe it is to improve the treatment success, the efficacy of the existing products. It's helpful to actually identify what all the unmet medical needs are for the patients with that condition that you're seeking an indication for, laying those out and identifying whether or not your product can address them. It actually makes a really strong case when you can lay out, here are all the needs and we're not addressing these, but we are addressing these other ones. And then specifically go through how you've met and are addressing that need. So bottom line, knowing all of these, knowing that you've accounted for them sets a really strong foundation to move forward with. I touched briefly on messaging because it is very important for your submission, laying out the messaging on key topics. The point I want to make with this slide is that people use a lot of different approaches for developing these, whether a target product profile, storyboard, key messaging document, or building it in the label. My cautionary note here is that seen situations where a lot of time and effort is put into a target product profile or storyboard or key messaging document, and you generate this large document with lots of text, and then when it comes time for the submission documents, you go to put that in there and the messages just don't work at all. You have to rewrite and refocus everything because it's been created out of the context of the actual summary documents. What I found works really well is to meet on a weekly basis, developing your annotated label, build the wording of the label, and that text works really well going back down into the summary documents and can be a really helpful way to generate messaging. So I mentioned at the beginning about whether you're planning forwards or backwards. I think in most cases these days, you're in the column on the right about planning backwards. There's been a major public commitment to stakeholders around what the submission date is. In that situation, you need to identify that critical path, what's the last piece of data, and this situation really, it can create some really compressed timelines at the end. The thing to focus on is identifying everything that is not dependent on that rate limiting piece and address it as early as possible so that in that compressed time at the end, you're only left with the things that have to wait until that time. If you're lucky enough to be able to plan forwards, then give yourself that time, build out a reasonable plan so that you're not constrained as much by that critical path. I won't go through all the items on this slide, but key here again, as you're building your plan, is to try to build in some flexibility, and some of that comes from getting commitments early on. So ideally, whatever way, even if you're planning backwards, you're getting to start these activities 12 to 18 months before your submission, so you have the time to work through these things and do that background research and set things up properly. One of the key points is agreeing and identifying your review and approval processes up front. Your timelines are going to be based on those. Are you really committing to 3 days for review. What does your approval process look like? Who are your approvers? One of the key points here is to make sure that somebody who's approving a document isn't seeing it for the first time when they're given it to sign off. That's just a recipe for having to go back and rework things. So once you've worked those things out, you need to establish that plan. You need to build it out in whatever system you're using for timelines. Then you need to maintain that and also generate, probably on a weekly basis, some sort of dashboard for communicating where things stand, and so the team knows what's coming up. And then you're going to have to make adjustments along the way. So things happen. So you want to be able to quickly evaluate what the impacts are. You want to change as little as you have to. And that I'd like to emphasize that don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. So you still have your messaging, you still have your end goal. You don't want to get off track, trapped in something that's just come up at the last minute. We'll touch briefly on tools. So there's a number of tools out there that can be used for creating timelines. Obviously, project management is a huge component of any submission effort. It is a huge effort. It can be a timeline plan that's 2,000-3,000 steps or more. It's a lot of people, a lot of functions, a lot of documentation. You need good project management and good project management tools, both for communication, be able to integrate information. So you want your timeline tools to talk across your other systems. It will help enhance your collaboration, especially if you're interacting with vendors. And you need to be able to provide real-time information and be able to adjust on the fly. So there are some common pitfalls. I've had opportunity to work on a lot of submissions through my career. It's been kind of a focus of mine, and see people get stuck on a lot of specific things. And so I wanted to just highlight a few common pitfalls. So one, especially with smaller biotech companies, a lack of experience. So you may have a team where very few of the team members have ever been involved in a submission before. That doesn't mean you can't do it. Everybody had to learn sometime. But it's helpful if you've been through the process and you know what done and an end looks like. So if you have limited experience, make the effort to try to ensure that the people who have that experience have opportunity to convey that and relate that and kind of mentor and lead the team through that. Try not to put too many things in parallel. So one thing that I'm seeing more and more as timelines get compressed due to pressures on completing submissions is trying to write summary documents in parallel with the underlying study reports. It can be done, but it's very painful. It's not very efficient. So especially if you have the opportunity to plan forwards, don't create that situation. Limited engagement. So I touched on this a moment ago around approval process. So make sure that your meetings where key items are getting discussed include all the necessary parties to get that specific input, whether it's PK or publishing or even QA, and that the key individuals such as approvers are engaged earlier on so that they're not seeing something for the first time when they're asked to sign off on it. Do not avoid gaps and weaknesses. So as I mentioned when going through the regulatory history especially, you're going to be a lot better off confronting those weaknesses, spelling out your view on those up front. Incomplete timelines. So if you haven't really thought through the dependencies, or if you've built a plan right from the beginning that automatically requires people working on weekends and holidays to stick to the timeline, that's a no-no. I think I see people kind of treat submissions as they're going to be stressful, they're going to be painful, we're just going to have to work weekends and holidays. Don't do that to yourself, especially if you're starting 12, 18 months in advance. Set up your timeline so that you're not already committing people to holidays and weekends. If you're able to stick to that timeline, you can avoid that. I've seen that done, seen it achieved. It's not automatically submissions equal weekend and holiday work. And then I've already spoken to the messaging cottage industry. So beware of creating a separate messaging deliverable document. And if you are doing that, test it along the way to make sure that the text, the messaging that you're creating actually works in the summary document so that people can actually basically copy and paste that into a summary to use. So I'd just like to end on communication. So anybody who's ever been through a lessons learned activity knows that communication is always coming up as one of the things that needs to be addressed. I say there's no such thing as over communication on a submission project. So you and your teams should be meeting regularly. You should document minutes, actions, and key decisions. And review those at subsequent meetings. That's how you hold the team accountable. Monitor your timelines and provide weekly updates to your team, and be the calm in the storm. Every major project hits a point where nobody thinks you're going to make it. If you're leading a submission, that's where you've got to be the calm, keep things going, get everyone through that rough spot and on to the next steps. All right, thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to introduce now Elaine Taylor, who's our VP of Regulatory Strategy and Policy. She has more than 30 years of pharma experience related to regulatory consulting and strategic guidance, especially in 505(b)(2) programs and agency meetings. And so she'll be covering those aspects for you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Let's see if I can advance the slides. It's working. So great. Glad to be here today. I'm going to share with you some of the best practices that I have found are important to ensure a successful submission strategy and also gain approval of your product. So I'm going to cover three main buckets: the all-important submission meetings, marketing application, and then I'm going to present a real case study to demonstrate what happens when your clinical overview is too biased or too commercial. Oops, see, I was afraid that would happen. One too far ahead. Okay, so here I want to show you an effect of meetings with the FDA. So a few years ago, I was giving a talk at DIA on the importance of meeting with the FDA. And afterwards, one of the FDA staff members who was in the audience came up to me and said she actually had data to prove that, you know, FDA meetings were very helpful and had an effect on approval process. So she sent me this table that I'm sharing with you, and this has been presented at an orphan products meeting from somebody from the FDA. So it shows here that the meetings with the FDA actually decreases the development time for new molecular entities and new biologics. And you see this most dramatically in the rare disease, where you can see that it reduces development by more than 10 years. It goes from an average of almost 17 years to approximately 6 years. And that trend holds true for the end of phase 2 meetings for rare diseases and also the pre-IND meetings for the non-rare disease. So the next time your boss wants to know why you're taking time to meet with the FDA or the EMA, you can show him you can show him this table for the FDA. And then I have another slide, if I can get it to advance. I'm having a little trouble with my mouse. Here we go. There we go. So you can, sorry, click was taken too long. So on this slide, you can actually see this is depicting the dramatic effect that you see on being compliant with the scientific advice. So it's important to meet with the agency, but here's what happens when you're compliant. If you're compliant, 97% of submissions were approved for applicants who were compliant with their scientific advice. You can contrast that with only 30% that were non-compliant. And if you received no scientific advice, you didn't go and meet with the EMA, only 72% of those received actual MAA approval. So these two slides show you the most important things you can do to ensure a positive outcome for your application is to meet with your regulatory authority and then also follow their advice. So we can see the positive effects of this scientific advice. So let's move on and look at what happened. If I get my mouse in the right spot. And look what happened. And I'd like to talk to you about actually successful meetings with the FDA or EMA. What are, with your regulatory authorities. This is very touchy. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble. It's very touchy with the mouse. I'm either going too far or not far enough. So whenever I talk about meeting with regulatory authorities, the first thing I always have to tell you is to follow the available guidance documents. You'll want to meet with the EMA or the FDA about 6 to 7 months before your filing of your marketing application. But make sure when you're preparing for this that you're following the latest available guidances. The regulatory authorities have issued guidances on meeting requests and packages. And even though you've been doing this for many years, and I've heard this from people over the years, oh, I've been doing this for so many years, and this is the package that I use, and it works well, and I like it. But I ask you to think about, what the FDA, they're getting the EMA and FDA, they're getting hundreds of packages. They have to review all this data. Wouldn't it be easier if all the information was in the same spot or flows the same for all the packages that they receive? So look at those guidances and rethink your strategy. And this is supported by a talk that I attended a few years ago at DIA that was given by a regulatory project manager. And she gave her top 10 list for successful meetings. And one of those tips was to please follow the guidance template. So they do find that it's important to them. And then, of course, moving on, you've got to ask the tough questions. What challenges are you faced with? Will you need a REMS? Are there specific statistical considerations that your product has to face, or your clinical trial? Are you going to have a complete package at the time of your initial submission? Are you going to plan to submit something on a rolling basis or during the review? And today, you might have to include a discussion about the impact of COVID. What has that had maybe on your phase 3 trial or one of the trials in your package, and the steps that you had to take to mitigate that impact and gain agreement with the FDA on that. And then, of course, asking these questions, it may seem obvious to you, but trust me, sponsors don't always discuss those tough questions. I worked with a sponsor whose their primary study, it didn't meet the primary endpoint. And they decided, I know you'll find this shocking, they decided not to discuss this at their pre-NDA meeting with the FDA. So they missed a tremendous opportunity to gain insight from the FDA on potential solutions or alternate approaches. And I'm sure you can guess that it didn't go well when they did and ultimately submit to the FDA. And this could have been avoided. In addition, do discuss your plan content and format. This could seem very standard, but be sure that you discuss it with the FDA and EMA, especially if you may be changing a few things. Are you going to submit an ISS? Are you going to submit an ISE? These are important things to discuss. And then at the meeting or when you're reading your preliminary responses, listen and pay attention to the answers that they're giving you. Do you need to change your plan? Or one thing that we had happen is that the regulators really didn't understand our question. They had interpreted it differently than we had intended it. And we realized this when we got a response that we hadn't expected. They had actually told us no. And we had thought it was a slam dunk yes. So when we got that and we were thinking about it, we thought, oh, maybe they didn't understand the question. And we then the next day had a face-to-face meeting with the FDA. This was an FDA meeting. And we brought that up. That was immediately what we said. Oh, we asked this question and this is what we meant by that question. And as soon as we clarified the question for them, they said, oh, well, if that's what you meant, we agree with you on that. So, make sure that they've understood your question. When you look at their responses, maybe that's why you're seeing a different response than you expect. And you can disagree with the responses that you get from these regulatory authorities, but you need to clearly explain your perspective, and you need to approach it from a scientific discussion. And after the meeting then, meet immediately if possible with the team that was at the meeting, so that you can hear what everybody heard. Did everybody hear it the same way? And then follow up on any action items. What are they requesting that you do? Is it something you weren't planning? How best can you meet their request? And after you review all of this, you may find out that you need a follow-up meeting, especially if you have a novel or a complex program. You may need to pull in other disciplines, and you may need to have a follow-up meeting. So be aware of that and prepare for that. But now that you've had your meeting with the regulatory authorities, I'd like to talk to you about your actual submission. Okay, I just lost the screen. Sorry. Okay, back. Just went blank on me for a minute. I don't know if you're seeing it yet. Okay, I hope it doesn't continue to flip because I hit this a couple times. So as you can tell, I believe in following requirements and guidances. I think it ensures a smooth process for your submissions. If I give you any tips, that's my primary one. So my first tip here is to know the ICH guidelines, follow them. Many countries follow them now, and use the country-specific guidances. You need to know those too, and any requirements that they may have. And identify the processes and timings. Sometimes, there's a lot of timings and processes that you have to follow prior to even submitting your documents and filing that marketing application. So create a checklist of all those pre-submission requirements so that you know what they are, and then you can, work on that while everybody else is worried about writing and the timelines. For example, in Europe, you have to reconfirm your submission date 2 to 3 months prior to your planned submission date. So you need to check back with them. Yes, we're still planning to submit on that date. And then, of course, there's a process for gaining agreement on invented names. So, you need to start that, or you can start that 18 months prior to your application, but for sure, at least 4 to 6 months prior. So make sure that you've accounted for all of that and you know what you need to do. So these are just a few of the activities that you need to think about. And in your application then, and Steve has addressed this, so I won't belabor it, what were the comments and recommendations that you've received from regulatory authorities? So you can see Steve's highlighted it, I've highlighted it. So it's an important thing to make sure that you understand what you followed and what you didn't, and that you discuss this in your submission. And then some people may put this first, and they wouldn't be wrong, labeling, because that is your goal. What are you going to get for labeling? So your program has been designed to provide the support for the indication and the content of your labeling. So you need to develop those labeling messages early. Your submission documents, they're going to have to provide the documentation to support the labeling. You have to think about what countries are you going to, if you're going to Canada, if you're going to Europe, if you're going to the US. For adverse events, for example, that you put in labeling, you may have a different cutoff point. You may use 1 or 2%, or you may use 5 or 10%. So think about that. What are you going to be putting in the labeling? And it can be different for the different countries because they do have different requirements. And of course, critically evaluate your data. Present those critical assessments in your clinical overview and your non-clinical overview. And I'm going to be talking, my case study is actually going to be looking at that clinical overview and how important it is to make sure that your presentation is unbiased and critical. So again, benefit risk assessment in that clinical overview is going to be really important. The FDA and EMA, they have a benefit risk framework that they've developed. So make sure that you understand what that is and what the expectations are. Many companies just include the FDA table, their assessment table in the US submissions, and that's perfectly fine. Some sponsors include a value tree. So they actually depict the benefit risk in a value tree. And then address any risk management that you had. And recently, in the last year, some of our oncology clients are now participating in the oncology assessment aid pilot. And that's where it's a voluntary submission from the applicant, and it's based on the FDA multidisciplinary review template. So you may, if you're in oncology, be asked. The FDA actually came to a couple of sponsors and asked them if they would submit this assessment voluntarily, and they agreed to do that. So I'm going to now focus on the case study. I'd like to present to you a case study. I'm going to try. Oh, good. It did change. So several years ago, I worked with an applicant. They were unwilling to see really any negative aspects of their product, and they didn't discuss it in the clinical overview. So the result was, after their submission during the 60-day evaluation period, the FDA came back and they asked them to rewrite their clinical overview. So they didn't have a refusal to file. The FDA came back to them and said, you need to rewrite your clinical overview. And they didn't give much details about that. So they came to me and asked me to rewrite it. So I did rewrite it, and as of what the final outcome was, that the application was then accepted and it was approved within the PDUFA goal date. So what was wrong? Not wrong, but what happened there? I looked at the product development rationale, and I had to expand on the discussion, the regulatory guidance and advice and how it was implemented, and also looked at what were the limitations of their data that they had, or of the clinical study that they wrote. Were there any limitations that we needed to point out to the agency? Because the overview is supposed to be a critical assessment of your program and your data. And don't forget that. Obviously, it's important to the FDA. They came back and asked for it to be rewritten. The overview of biopharm and pharmacology, I did not essentially have to make any changes. And then, of course, efficacy and safety, I did some reorganization. I'm looking at the time, and we're getting really short on time, so I'm going to go pretty fast through the rest of this. Not that I don't think it's important, but we do want to have some time for questions and answers. That benefit and risk conclusions, that was where I spent a lot of time. They had presented just a bulleted list of benefits and had positive positioning. They didn't have any risk, essentially, that they talked about. So I revised it all. I put in the risk based on the results of their studies conducted, added more about the disease condition and the current therapies. So really made it more of a critical assessment. And this was before the framework. We had the framework, but I added that in. I didn't add the framework in, but again, talking about both benefits and risk. So I'm going to go through the next slide pretty fast. So you may be a true believer, but the regulators, they need data. So strive to be impartial. You can't hide the data. Every data package has problem areas. Explain it proactively. Steve talked about this. I've talked about it. And then understand and address any regulatory concerns. So 3 principles, 3 key takeaways. It was hard for me to come up with them. Conduct a pre-submission meeting, tackle those tough questions, create a checklist, be proactive. So Jessica, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we can take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. And we do have some questions coming in. This first question is for Steve. Steve, in general, for a BLA, how much time would you allow for publishing after the last document comes in?
Sorry, just getting off of mute there. It depends to a large extent on the size, overall size of the submission and how many of the pieces are coming in at the last minute. So if you're only waiting on one last area, say stability documents for CMC or just the clinical overview and label at the end, then you can make that timing pretty tight. I know there are, you're probably looking at, depending on the publishing vendor, you're probably looking at 1 to 2, 3 week time period from that last document. If you're talking about a cover letter as the last document, then that could be just days before. But you're going to want to leave and plan for a few weeks at the end. If you're talking about everything's all coming in at the same time, you're not finalizing, module 5 and some of those study reports, and you've got, non-clinical summaries coming in late as well, and some of the CMC documents, then you might have to account for several weeks to a month to handle all of that, because all the linking that's going to need to get done along with the publishing of those.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Second question for any of you. How do you successfully implement a common core data sheet when no one is used to developing and using this for global expansion? Elaine, would you like to
Elaine, do you want to?
Yeah, everybody's looking at me. Well, it is difficult, as you said, it is difficult, but it's important because, as you look to other countries, you certainly want to have, a common ground that all the countries have to have in them. Certainly as regulations change, you've got to look at that. But, how to successfully implement that, you've got to get your management buy-in, obviously, because they're going to be that's going to be most important. But then you can also look at the regulations. And I think that if you can show that time can be saved, management can be very interested in saving time. So, having a core data sheet that you're relying on, that is, that you can go to, and updating it periodically as data comes in and as data changes, I think that is a good selling point for using one. Steve or Demetrius, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to what you're saying, other than obviously it depends on the plans for how many markets you want to pursue your product in. And so the broader the scope of what you're proposing to do, the greater the need for that.
Thank you. It looks like we are out of time. So if we did not get to your question, please email us at contact@synchrogenics.com or message us via LinkedIn or Twitter, and we will respond to your question as soon as we are able. And at this time, I'd like to thank you all, and I will turn it back over to Raps.
Thanks, Jessica, and thank you to our speakers, Demetrius Carter, Steve Sibley, and Elaine Taylor, for their time and sharing their expertise with us today. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for attending today's webcast and for your great questions. Once you leave the webcast today, an evaluation survey will display on your browser. Please take a couple of minutes to fill out the survey and provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within a couple of hours with the completion code for this webcast. So on behalf of Raps and Satara, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.